At Dad's funeral, I heard my brother whisper to the lawyer, "We need to hide the real will." I pretended not to know, but a week later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing and police were at their door. The weight of my father's casket surprised me, even with 5 others helping to carry it. I guess that's fitting. Dad always made his presence known, in life and now in death. I was positioned behind Nathan, my older brother, who barely showed any strain as we walked down the church aisle. The perfect son act, right to the end. I hadn't cried yet. Not when I got the call about Dad's heart attack. Not during the 3 days of arrangement. Not even when I saw him laid out in the casket, looking smaller somehow than the towering figure who built a business from nothing into something worth fighting over. The numbness was a blessing, I think. The service was what Dad would have wanted. Practical. No unnecessary flourishes. Just like how he ran his life and raised us after Mom died. The church was packed. Dad might have been a hard ass, but he was respected. I sat between Audrey, my younger sister, who couldn't stop sobbing dramatically, and Nathan, who maintained the appropriate somber expression while checking his watch every few minutes. It was during the reception afterward when it happened. I was heading to the bathroom in the funeral home when I rounded the corner and nearly walked straight into Nathan and Daryl huddled in a secluded hallway. I instinctively stepped back, not wanting to interrupt whatever private moment they were having. That's when I heard it. "We need to hide the real will," Nathan whispered urgently. "Dad changed it 2 months ago. If Kane finds out—" Daryl nodded, his voice too low for me to catch everything, but I clearly heard, "taken care of," and "paperwork already filed." I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was hearing. My brother and Dad's lawyer of 20 years were conspiring to hide Dad's actual will? I backed away silently, grateful for the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. For the rest of the reception, I went through the motions, accepting condolences, thanking people for coming, all while watching Nathan and Audrey exchange glances whenever Daryl spoke to someone. I noticed how Audrey kept touching her necklace, a nervous habit she's had since childhood. They were in on it together. Dad had mentioned updating his will during our last fishing trip 3 months ago. We weren't close when I was younger. I was the middle child who never quite fit his expectations. But after I turned 30 and started my own business, something shifted. We found common ground, started rebuilding. He seemed proud of me for the first time. "Made some changes to reflect how things stand now," he'd said casually as we packed up our gear. "Life's too short for old grudges, son." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Now, those words took on a different meaning. That night after the funeral, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nathan's face, heard his whispered words. The more I thought about it, the more things made sense. Nathan had been unusually attentive to Dad in his final months, calling more, stopping by the house. I'd been grateful then, thinking he was mending their strained relationship. Now I wondered if he'd somehow learned about the updated will. The next morning I made a decision. Rather than confronting them directly, I'd dig deeper. Dad always taught us to gather all the facts before making a move. "The person with the best information wins," he'd say. For once I'd follow his advice. I started with Dad's home office. Nathan had insisted on handling the estate, but I still had my key to the house. Dad was meticulous about his paperwork, tax returns, business records, everything labeled and filed. But the cabinet where he kept legal documents was completely empty. Not just the will, everything was gone. I searched his computer next, but found it had been wiped clean. Too clean. This wasn't just someone deleting files. This was professional-level erasure. My gut twisted with certainty. They'd already been here. What hit me hardest wasn't just the betrayal. It was how prepared they were, how quickly they moved. Dad was barely cold in the ground, and they'd already sanitized every trace of his true intention. The official reading of the will was scheduled for the following week. When I called Daryl's office to confirm, his secretary sounded nervous, stumbling over her words when I asked if there had been any recent changes to Dad's will. No, Mr. Kane. The last will we have on file is from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, before Dad and I reconnected. Before he told me he'd made changes. That evening, Nathan called. His voice was casual, brotherly even. "Hey, just checking in. How are you holding up?" "Managing," I replied, matching his tone while my free hand clenched into a fist. "Just trying to process everything. I know, it's a lot. Listen, about Dad's estate. Don't worry about any of that right now. Daryl and I are handling the paperwork. You focus on yourself." How generous of— "Actually," I said carefully, "Dad mentioned updating his will a few months back. Did he ever talk to you about that?" The silence lasted just a beat too long. "No, nothing specific. You know how Dad was, always talking about doing things but never getting around to them. Anyway, Daryl says everything's in order. I bet he does." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at Dad's old pocket watch, the only thing of his I'd taken from the house so far. It had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that. Dad had always said it would go to the son who truly understood the value of time. Something broke inside me, the numbness cracked, and underneath wasn't sadness, but a white-hot rage that clarified everything. They thought I was the same pushover I'd been all my life, the middle child who never made waves, who could be sidelined and forgotten. They were wrong. I pulled out my laptop and started making notes on everything I knew, everything I remembered Dad saying about his plans, his business, his assets. Then I sent a message to Morgan, my college roommate who now worked with digital data. If anyone could recover deleted files, it would be him. Next, I called Brooke, an old friend who owed me a favor. She had ways of finding information that most people couldn't. I needed to know what Nathan and Audrey had been up to in the months before Dad died. 3 days after the funeral, I drove to Dad's bank. I wasn't on any of his accounts, but something told me to try anyway. The manager recognized me and offered condolences. "I was sorry to hear about your father," she said. "He was just in last month updating his safety deposit box access." My heart raced. "His safety deposit box?" She checked her computer. "Yes, he added you as an authorized user. Would you like to access it today?" Nathan and Audrey must not have known about the box, or they would have emptied it already. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it, a USB drive, and a small key I didn't recognize. The envelope contained a personal letter from Dad, explaining that he'd updated his will to reflect his wishes that his business be split more evenly among his children, with specific provisions about who would control what aspects based on our strength. He specifically mentioned giving me controlling interest in the tech division I'd helped modernize. "Nathan won't like this," he wrote, "but it's the right decision for the company and for all of you. I've kept a copy of the new will here, and with my new attorney, Morgan's father. Daryl has been acting strangely since I mentioned the changes, so I took precautions." The rage I felt earlier crystallized into something colder, more focused. This wasn't just about money. This was about Dad's legacy, his final wishes, and my siblings were spitting on both. The USB drive contained copies of emails between Dad and his new attorney, the updated will itself, and, most damning of all, a video Dad had recorded explaining his decision, clearly of sound mind and body. As I drove home with this explosive evidence secured, my phone lit up with a text from Brooke. "Found something interesting. N's been meeting with D regularly for months. D made large cash withdrawals after each meeting. Also, check A's social media from March 16th. I pulled over and searched for Audrey's Instagram post from that date. It showed her and Nathan at a restaurant looking celebratory. The caption read, "Planning big changes with Big Bro. Dad would be so shocked if he knew." March 16th, 2 days after Dad told me he'd updated his will. My phone rang. Morgan calling. "Dude, you were right. Someone did a professional job on your dad's computer, but they missed the cloud backup. I've recovered a ton of documents, including emails where your dad told Nathan about changing the will in February. Nathan did not take it well. Everything clicked into place. The strange meetings, the cash payment, the convenient heart attack just months after Nathan learned he was losing control of the company. I pulled back onto the road, the small key from the safety deposit box burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't know what it opened yet, but I had a feeling it would be the final piece I needed. They thought I was the weak one, the one who would accept whatever scraps they offered without question. They never saw me as a threat. That was their first mistake. I turned my car toward Dad's lake house. The one place Nathan always avoided because he hated the outdoors. The one place Dad and I had reconnected over the past few years. The one place where Dad kept his most private record, in a safe built into the stone fireplace. I had a key to try, evidence to gather, and a promise to keep to the only person who'd finally seen my worth. Nathan and Audrey had no idea what was coming for them. Update 1. The drive to Dad's lake house took almost 2 hours, giving me plenty of time to replay every interaction I'd had with Nathan and Audrey over the past few months. All those concerned looks they exchanged when I mentioned spending time with Dad. The way they'd change the subject whenever I brought up the business. The fake sympathy in Nathan's voice when he called to check on me. It made me sick thinking about how they must have laughed behind my back, plotting while Dad was still alive. The lake house looked exactly as it had during my last visit with Dad 3 months ago. The fishing rods still leaned against the porch railing where we'd left them. His battered deck chair still faced the water. For a moment, I could almost see him sitting there, beer in hand, watching the sunset. The memory didn't bring sadness this time. It brought resolve. Inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Nathan hated this place, always complaining about the spotty cell service and lack of proper amenities. Audrey visited occasionally, but spent more time taking photos for social media than actually enjoying the surrounding. Only Dad and I appreciated the solitude here. I went straight to the stone fireplace. Behind a loose stone near the base was a small keyhole, perfectly matched to the key from the safety deposit box. The hidden compartment contained exactly what I'd hoped to find. A waterproof case with more documents. Inside were bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts in Nathan's name starting 6 months ago. Detailed notes in Dad's handwriting documenting his suspicions that money was being siphoned from the company. A second copy of the new will. And most damning of all, a handwritten letter addressed to me. Kane, if you're reading this, something's happened to me before I could confront Nathan about what he's been doing. The evidence is all here. I've been building a case quietly, was planning to bring it to the board next month. I wanted to give him a chance to explain himself first. Maybe I was wrong to wait. Trust no one except Morgan's father with this information, not even my own lawyer. I sat on Dad's old couch, papers spread around me, as the reality hit. This wasn't just about changing the will. Nathan had been stealing from the company for months. Dad had discovered it, and now Dad was conveniently dead. My phone buzzed. A text from Brooke. Found something about A2. She's been selling company information to competitors. Check the files I'm sending. The documents showed Audrey had accessed confidential product development files and passed them to our biggest competitor. The dates aligned perfectly with her sudden ability to afford her luxury apartment and designer wardrobe on what should have been a modest salary. They weren't just trying to steal my inheritance, they had been actively undermining Dad and the company he built while he was still alive. I must have sat there for hours, combing through everything, organizing the evidence. By the time I left the lake house, I had a clear picture of what had happened and what needed to happen next. Over the next few days, I maintained my grieving brother act. I attended the official will reading where Daryl presented the old will, the one giving Nathan controlling interest in the company and the bulk of Dad's personal assets, with smaller portions to Audrey and me. I nodded solemnly, expressing appropriate disappointment but no suspicion. I know this is difficult, Nathan said afterward, his hand on my shoulder, but Dad always wanted what was best for the company. Someone needs to be in charge. I looked him in the eye and smiled sadly. You're right. Dad always did want what was best for the company. The flicker of relief on his face was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Meanwhile, Morgan had recovered more files from Dad's computer backup. Email exchanges between Nathan and Daryl discussing how to handle the Kane situation if I became problematic. Audrey's communications with our competitors, including proposed meeting dates, one just 2 days after Dad's funeral. Most disturbing was a text exchange between Nathan and Audrey from the day Dad died. It's done. Heart attack. No signs of anything else. You sure it can't be traced? Positive. Talk in person only from now on. I stared at those messages for a long time. The implication was clear, but proving it would be nearly impossible. I focused instead on what I could prove: the financial fraud, the stolen company secret, and the will tampering. I made copies of everything and stored them in multiple secure locations. I met with Morgan's father, who confirmed the new will was legally binding despite not being presented at the official reading. He agreed to help me build a case. A week after the funeral, I decided it was time to apply some pressure. I called Daryl's office and requested a private meeting. His secretary seemed nervous. "Mr. Daryl is very busy this week. Tell him it's about my father's lake house property. I have some questions about the deed." 20 minutes later, Daryl himself called back. "Kane, of course I can see you. How's tomorrow afternoon?" The tension in his voice told me everything I needed to know. When I arrived at his office, Daryl was sweating despite the cool air conditioning. He ushered me in quickly, closing the door behind us. "What can I help you with regarding the lake house?" he asked, shuffling papers on his desk. I placed a single document in front of him, a copy of Dad's notes about the new will. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my father's final wishes," I said calmly. The color drained from his face. "Where did you get this? Does it matter? I have the new will, Daryl, the real one, and I know Nathan paid you to hide it." He started to deny it, then stopped, assessing me with new eyes. "Kane, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. Your brother was concerned about the company's stability. Your father made some impulsive decisions near the end. Impulsive decisions like discovering Nathan was embezzling millions, or finding out Audrey was selling company secrets. Those kinds of impulsive decisions?" Daryl's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "Those are serious accusations. They're documented facts, and I have copies of all your communications with Nathan discussing how to handle me if I became a problem." The facade crumbled completely. Daryl slumped in his chair, suddenly looking much older. "What do you want?" "I want you to call Nathan. Tell him you can't go through with it anymore. Don't mention me. Just say you're out. He'll know something's wrong." That's the idea. After I left Daryl's office, I drove to the company headquarters. Using the keycard Dad had given me months ago, I accessed his executive office, which Nathan had already started moving into. I planted small recording devices in strategic locations and downloaded specific financial files I'd need. On my way out, I ran into Audrey in the hallway. "Kane, what are you doing here?" Her surprise quickly shifted to suspicion. "Just picking up some of Dad's personal items," I said, holding up a framed photo I'd grabbed from his desk. "Sentimental stuff." "Oh," she relaxed slightly. "Nathan's been meaning to call you about. We need to clear out his office soon for reorganization purpose. No rush. I'm sure Nathan has more important things to deal with right now." "How's the transition going?" "Good. Great, actually. The board's been very supportive of Nathan taking over." "That's good to hear. Dad would want a smooth transition." Her hand went to her necklace, twisting it nervously. "Exactly. That's exactly what Dad would want." "By the way," I added casually, "have you been to the lake house recently? I was thinking of spending some time there." Her eyes widened slightly. "The lake house? No, Nathan was talking about selling it, actually. It's not really useful to any of us." "Huh. That's not what Dad told me. He specifically mentioned wanting to keep it in the family. Said he'd made provisions for it." "Well, the will was pretty clear about Nathan handling the properties," she said quickly. "Anyway, I should get going. Meeting in 5. I watched her hurry away, already pulling out her phone, probably calling Nathan to warn him I'd been asking questions. Good. That evening, as expected, Nathan called. His voice was controlled but tense. "Kane, Audrey mentioned you were at the office today." "Yeah, just grabbing some of Dad's stuff. Hope that's okay." "Of course. It's just we're trying to organize everything. If you let me know when you're coming, I can make sure you get what you need." Translation: "I don't want you wandering around unsupervised." "Sure thing. By the way, did Daryl call you today? He seemed weird when I stopped by to ask about the lake house deed." The silence that followed told me everything. "Daryl called, yes," Nathan finally said. "He's under a lot of stress. Listen, about the lake house, it makes more financial sense to sell it. I can make sure you get a fair portion of the proceeds." "That's generous of you," I replied, injecting just enough sarcasm to make him pause. "But I think I'll hold off on any decisions until things are more settled." Another silence. "What does that mean?" "It means Dad's only been gone a week. I'm not ready to start selling off pieces of him yet. After we hung up, I checked the app connected to the recording devices I'd planted. Nathan called Audrey immediately after our conversation, his voice urgent. He knows something. Daryl's freaking out, and now Kane's asking about the lake house. Do you think he found the safe? Audrey's voice was higher than usual. I don't know, but we need to move faster. Start transferring everything tomorrow. I don't care if it looks suspicious. What about Daryl? Forget him. He's a liability now. If he talks, we're both finished. I smiled to myself as I listened. They were getting sloppy, making mistakes. Exactly what I needed. The next morning, I met with Morgan's father, who had prepared the legal documents we'd need. Then I called Brooke, who had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Nathan and Audrey's activities over the past 6 months. Everything was ready, all the evidence gathered, all the pieces in place. Tomorrow would be exactly 1 week since the funeral. 1 week since I'd heard Nathan whisper about hiding the real will. 1 week of playing the oblivious, grieving brother while methodically building my case. I sent identical text messages to Nathan and Audrey. Need to talk about Dad's will. My place, 7 p.m. tomorrow. Important. Nathan replied immediately, "What's this about?" I didn't respond. Let him sweat. Audrey wrote back an hour later, "Can't make it tomorrow. How about next week?" I replied simply, "Not optional." That night, I sat on my balcony looking at Dad's pocket watch. The company he built had been his life's work, his legacy. He'd trusted me to protect it when he discovered what Nathan and Audrey were doing. I wouldn't let him down. My phone pinged with an alert from one of the recording devices. Nathan was in Dad's office, frantically searching through the remaining files. I watched through the security camera as he became increasingly agitated, throwing papers around, and eventually slamming his fist on the desk. "Where is it?" he shouted to the empty room. Where the hell did he put it? I knew what he was looking for. Dad's private ledger, where he documented his suspicion. The ledger that was currently sitting in my safe, along with all the other evidence. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the day after tomorrow. Nathan didn't know it yet, but he wouldn't be running the company by then. Neither would Audrey be keeping her position, and Daryl would be facing disbarment at minimum. As for criminal charges, well, that would depend on what happened at our little family meeting tomorrow night. I closed the pocket watch with a satisfying click. Dad had been right about the value of time. Nathan and Audrey had run out of theirs. The game of pretending not to know was almost over, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when they realized how badly they'd underestimated me. Update 2, I barely slept the night before our family meeting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face. Not the frail man in the hospital bed during his final days, but the strong, determined man who built a business from nothing while raising 3 kids alone after Mom died. The man who finally saw my worth in his last years. The man whose legacy deserved better than what Nathan and Audrey had planned. By 6 a.m., I was already on my 3rd cup of coffee, reviewing every document one final time. My apartment was meticulously prepared. Recording devices hidden throughout the living room, copies of all evidence laid out on the dining table but covered with a tablecloth, and a small camera disguised as a clock on the bookshelf. Morgan had helped set everything up the night before, his face grim as he looked through the evidence. "They really thought they'd get away with this," he'd said, shaking his head. "They almost did," I replied. At 11 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. Package delivered. She'd sent copies of all the evidence to Morgan's father as a backup, just in case Nathan and Audrey tried anything desperate tonight. Around noon, Daryl called. His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Kane, I'm not sure what you're planning, but I want you to know that I was just following instructions from—" I cut him off. "Save it for the deposition, Daryl. You had 20 years of my father's trust, and you threw it away for whatever Nathan offered you. I'm not interested in your excuses." The silence that followed told me he understood exactly how deep the hole he dug himself was. "Will you be at the meeting tonight?" he finally asked. "No, Daryl. Your invitation must have gotten lost in the mail." After hanging up, I watched through the app as he immediately called Nathan, who didn't pick up. Then Audrey, who did. Their conversation was brief, but revealing. Daryl was looking for assurances that wouldn't implicate him further, and Audrey clearly had no patience for his panic. The afternoon dragged on. each minute feeling like 10. I forced myself to eat something, knowing I needed to be sharp tonight. The food tasted like nothing. I checked my watch, Dad's watch, repeatedly, feeling its weight as a reminder of what I was fighting for. At 6:30 p.m., my security system alerted me that someone was at the door. Through the camera, I saw Nathan standing there alone, 30 minutes early. Classic power move trying to catch me off guard. I waited 5 minutes before buzzing him up. His face, when I opened the door, was a practiced mask of brotherly concern. "Kane, good to see you. Thought I'd come a bit early to catch up before we get into whatever this is about." I gestured him inside, noticing how his eyes darted around my apartment, assessing, always calculating, always looking for an angle. He declined my offer of a drink and sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa. "So," he started, his voice carefully neutral, "you wanted to talk about Dad's will?" "Among other things," I replied, "but let's wait for Audrey." The discomfort of sitting in silence clearly grated on him. Nathan had always hated quiet moments, always needed to fill the air with his voice, his opinion. I said nothing, just watched him fidget with his expensive watch, bought, no doubt, with money stolen from Dad's company. At 6:55, Audrey arrived, looking harried and annoyed. "This better be important, Kane. I had to reschedule dinner with." She stopped when she saw Nathan already there, her expression shifting subtly from irritation to wariness. The tension in the room was palpable as she sat as far from Nathan as possible without being obvious about it. Interesting. Not as united as they appeared. "Thanks for coming," I said, moving to stand by the dining table. "I wanted to talk to you both about some discoveries I've made since Dad's funeral." Nathan's posture stiffened. "Discoveries?" "Yes, starting with something I overheard at the funeral." I looked directly at him. "You told Daryl you needed to hide the real will. Dad's updated will." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might pass out. Audrey's hand went to her necklace, twisting it frantically. "I don't know what you think you heard," Nathan started, his voice strained. "But—" "Save it," I interrupted, pulling the tablecloth off the dining table to reveal the organized stacks of evidence. "I have it all. The real will. The financial records showing your embezzlement. Audrey's communications with our competitors. The offshore accounts. Everything." Audrey stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. I'm leaving." "Sit down." Something in my tone, something I'd never used with either of them before, made her freeze. "You'll want to hear this part." I walked them through it all, methodically laying out each piece of evidence. The will that gave me controlling interest in the tech division, the documented theft totaling nearly $8 million, the company secrets Audrey had sold for luxury purchases, Dad's notes about his suspicions, dated weeks before his death. Nathan attempted denials at first, then tried to minimize, then finally switched to threats. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Kane. No idea what I'm capable of." "Actually, I do," I replied, playing the recording of his conversation with Audrey the day Dad died, the one implying they'd had something to do with his heart attack. Audrey broke first, her voice high and panicked. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The doctor said it would just make him sick enough to delay the board meeting. We needed time to move things around." Nathan's head whipped toward her. "Shut up, Audrey." But she couldn't stop now, words tumbling out. "You said it wouldn't hurt him, just slow him down. You said he'd recover. The medication wasn't supposed to. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just stolen from Dad, they'd killed him. They'd actually killed him to prevent him from exposing them. For one dangerous moment, I considered reaching for the fireplace poker and ending them both right there. My vision narrowed, blood pounding in my ears. But then I remembered Dad's voice clear as day. "Always play the long game, son. Revenge is a dish best served through proper channels." I stepped back, took a deep breath, and pressed a button on my phone. The apartment door opened, and in walked Morgan's father with 2 police officers. "Right on time," I said quietly. "I think you heard everything you needed to?" They had. As Nathan and Audrey were read their rights, the reality of their situation finally seemed to dawn on them. Nathan lunged at me, restrained just in time by one officer. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "I still have connections you can't touch. The board will never accept you." I smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. The board meeting's tomorrow, Nathan. I've already sent them copies of everything, including your confession about Dad's medication. They've called an emergency session. As they were led away, Audrey's mascara-streaked face turned back to me. Kane, please. I was just following Nathan's lead. You know how he is. I didn't want any of this. I looked at my sister, really looked at her. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the carefully manicured image that had always been more important to her than family. Goodbye, Audrey. The next 48 hours were a blur of statements, meetings, and phone calls. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Board members wanting assurances, reporters hearing rumors, employees seeking clarity. Nathan and Audrey were denied bail due to flight risk, given the offshore accounts and serious nature of the charges. Daryl, desperate to save himself, turned state's evidence, providing even more details about their scheme. His license was still suspended pending investigation, but he'd avoid jail time. The most surreal call came from Ember, Nathan's wife. She'd been kept in the dark about everything, apparently. The embezzlement, the will, all of it. The shock in her voice seemed genuine as she asked if I could explain what was happening, why police had searched her house that morning. I gave her the facts without emotion. By the end of our conversation, she was making arrangements to stay with her sister while consulting a divorce attorney. 3 days after their arrest, I stood at the front of the boardroom, presenting the new company structure based on Dad's true wishes. As the interim CEO until things stabilized, I outlined our path forward, including my plans to recover the stolen funds and rebuild the relationships damaged by Nathan and Audrey's action. 1 week later, I visited the lake house again. The place felt different now, no longer heavy with secrets, but peaceful in its simplicity. I sat in Dad's chair overlooking the water, his pocket watch in my hand. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for next month. The evidence was overwhelming, with additional charges being considered as the financial investigation deepened. Nathan and Audrey would be facing significant prison time for fraud, embezzlement, corporate espionage, and potentially manslaughter or second-degree murder, depending on what the medical examination of Dad's remains revealed. Everything they'd built, the false success, the lavish lifestyles, the carefully crafted personas, had crumbled. Nathan's wife was divorcing him. Audrey's so-called friends had vanished along with her social media presence. Their assets were frozen, their reputations destroyed. Some might expect me to feel conflicted or sad about destroying my own siblings. I didn't, not even for a moment. They had stolen not just money or a company, but years I could have had with Dad. Years where I'd believed he favored them, when in reality, he'd been coming to see their true nature while recognizing my value. They had taken something irreplaceable from me, and now they were paying the price. The justice system would handle their official punishment, but the personal destruction, the complete dismantling of their lives and futures, that had been my contribution, my revenge. A text message interrupted my thoughts. Morgan, updating me about Nathan's latest failed attempt to secure release. Apparently, he'd offered to return all the stolen money in exchange for dropped charges. The prosecutor had declined. I put the phone away and looked out at the water. In the distance, a boat moved slowly across the horizon, its wake spreading behind it. Actions have consequences that extend far beyond the moment. Nathan and Audrey were learning that lesson the hard way. Dad's company was recovering already. With the truth exposed, employees rallied around the new leadership. The tech division I now controlled was projecting record growth for the quarter. Dad's legacy would not only survive but thrive. As the sun began to set, I closed the pocket watch and placed it carefully in my pocket. There was still work to do, statements to prepare for the upcoming trial, a company to lead. But for the first time since Dad died, I felt something like peace. Not forgiveness, never that, but a quiet satisfaction in knowing they would never harm anyone else the way they'd harmed Dad, the way they'd tried to harm me. Sometimes the world actually delivers justice, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Dad had taught me that in the end, perhaps the most valuable inheritance of all.